mini-series about the Hebrew language, Lashon HaKodesh, which we are dividing into three parts. We spoke about the various scripts, the various alphabets, the differences between the Ktav Ashuri, the Hebrew script that we have in use today, and the old Hebrew script. And I explained how the world, according to our tradition, was created in Lashon HaKodesh as the first language. And the Ktav Ashuri is the script, the holy script, that is in use today, which was also used to write the tablets. According to most opinions, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrote the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, in that script. We spoke about the various alphabets that existed in the world, the evolvement of those alphabets over time, including Ktav Rashi and so forth. Amongst the Jewish people, various scripts have been used in addition to Ktav Ashuri. However, what's more important than the alphabet is the language itself. The language is called the holy language because it is the language in which the world was created. And what we're going to be doing tonight is speaking a little bit about this unique language. And next week, B'ezrat Hashem, will be the third part of the series, where we'll actually take apart every letter of the alphabet and see for ourselves how it is unique. It is not just man-made. It is not just symbols to describe various sounds that we make in communicating, but it is actually composed of all kinds of ideas. And not only does every letter represent something special and unique, but when we start putting the letters together, it actually makes sense why, for example, an elephant is called pil. Why is it made up of the three letters Pei, Yud, Lamed? So next week is a fascinating topic, and I will also include for the first time ever, I've never done this before, the pronunciation of every single letter according to what it was originally. Approximately, we don't know 100%, but approximately how the original pronunciation of every letter and vowel was. Because unfortunately, because of the Galut, today we have the Ashkenaz pronunciation, the Sephardic, the Yemenite, and so forth. So as we go through every letter of the alphabet, we'll talk about the significance of them, how they are used to create words in a very unique way, and the pronunciation. But today is a very fascinating topic. It's one of the most incredible topics ever that I've ever discussed. Tremendous amount of work and research went into this. And Baruch Hashem, I was able to find other individuals who have done some work on this, so I did not have to reinvent the wheel. I was able to use some of their examples, which I will include tonight, in proving a very important point, a point that is being argued upon by linguistics, or linguists, I should say, linguists who study languages. There's a concept called monogenesis. Monogenesis is a fancy word to describe the mother of all tongues. Is there such a thing? Now, for those who do not believe in creation, they have a hard time. They really have a hard time explaining how did all the languages all of a sudden evolve? And we have so many. That couldn't have been by just evolution, like they claim man came about by evolution. Language in itself just to come up, I mean, how did they all decide on talking in a certain way? So, according to most linguists, it is a mystery. To them, it's a mystery. They don't really have an answer. They don't want to say that it all comes from one language, because if it is, they have a hard time figuring out what that language is. And you will see why it's not easy to figure it out unless you're willing to make certain assumptions, or unless, like the Jewish people, we have a tradition that everything does come from one mother language, and that is Lashon HaKodesh, that the world was created in this language. It is the first language from which all the languages came. And as I partially explained last week, this all came about, the beginning of the changes that affected languages was in Babylonia. That's where the word Bavel comes from, Kisham Hashem Balal. That's where the languages were confused. That is where they were mixed up. And little by little, they started changing more and more. So, what do we have today? Today, we have language families that everybody agrees on. that if you study languages, you will find certain similarities. Now, you may not be able to clearly see the names of the families here, but you may have heard of Indo-European languages. Even Persian and English are related because they both belong to the Indo-European language family. They may not sound the same. They're very, very different in syntax, in how you put together words. Persian, for example, has the verb at the end, where English doesn't have that kind of speech. Right? There's various differences in how to put together words. Nevertheless, they belong to the same family. They are related. Linguists are able to see certain similarities between the languages, and I'm going to share with you quite a bit of those similarities, because the most fascinating part of the similarities is that you can actually see, sometimes more easily than others, how they all come from the original root in Lashon HaKodesh. Because when we talk about a root, we're talking about the 2-3 basic letters that always exist, more or less. But then there's additions that were added to the word or to the root. So we're going to go through various rules in linguistics. So it's going to be a little bit of a course in linguistics, where we're going to learn about the etymology of words. The etymology meaning, where is a word derived from? There is an etymology dictionary of English words, and you will see many words in English coming from Old French, coming from Latin, coming from Greek, and so forth. And many words that they don't know, that they have to guess. There are words, of course, today in the English language that are borrowed from Yiddish, like chutzpah, right? Many words have come into many languages today that are borrowed. So if we recognize the word as a borrowed word, then we know that that's not original English. It's borrowed from another language. So today the world is divided pretty much into families. There are a few languages, however, that are isolated languages. Isolated languages meaning that somehow the linguists cannot figure out where they come from. Basque, the language spoken in northern Spain and southern France, is one of those. Greek is another one. And even a little bit to a certain extent Albanian. They don't really know what the source is. I mean, with Albanian they know a little bit. There are some languages that they don't fit into anything else. I mean, we know the Romance languages, right? French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian, the main ones. There's a few others. They come from Latin. Soldiers of the Roman Empire were running around the place, and they were not always speaking perfect Latin. They were speaking vulgar Latin, and from the vulgar Latin, with the addition of words from other languages in the neighborhood, you have the changes. Today nobody really speaks Latin. There are people who insist on speaking Latin, but for the most part, these languages have taken over what used to be Latin. They resemble each other, but they're not. You cannot always understand. In other words, they're sufficiently different that they're not necessarily intelligible. Some of it, yes, some of it not, depending how much one may have had exposure to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about dialects too. So you have languages being transformed over time and belonging to certain families. You have the Slavic languages, the Russian, the Polish, the Ukrainian, similar. And even if you go down to the area of Iran, you will find certain languages that belong to that family. For example, the Bukhari language, the Tajiki language, right? And even the Dari language of Afghanistan. These are all languages that belong pretty much to the same older language. Now, today, the Farsi that is being spoken in Iran today is not the same language that was spoken there years ago. In that country known as Iran or Persia, many languages have been spoken over time. But in the past few hundred years, there's been a big introduction of Arabic words. And there's a tremendous amount of Arabic words in Persian today. So the language has changed over time as a result of influences of other languages, as a result of borrowing from other languages and the like. So you have language families, you have African languages, you have Indian languages, and you have, of course, the Chinese or the East Asian type of languages that are very, very different. It is important to keep in mind that in the very, very beginning, as you can see in the Torah, when Hashem created man, towards the end of creation, he created a human being. There was something special about him. He was endowed, he was given a neshama. Now, when the Torah describes him receiving a neshama, it says, "Vaypach be'apav nishmat chayim v'ayi adam lenefesh chaya." Lenefesh chaya means to a living spirit, as you can see the translation in the English there. He breathed into his nostrils the soul of life, and man became a living soul. So the Targum Onkelos, that translates the Hebrew text into Aramaic, says the key here, the uniqueness of the human being, lies in the words lenefesh chaya, leruach memalela. The human being became a ruach memalela. He was given the ability of speech. That is where the big difference between man and animals lies. Besides that we have free will, which is also a big difference, not just instinct, we have the ability to communicate in a very special way. So you may say, but wait a minute, dolphins communicate very well too. It's true. Dolphins actually are pretty intelligent. There's different ways that all of life, any life form can communicate, but it's not a very developed or intelligent type of communication. It is a limited form of communication. According to our tradition, Shlomo Melech, Solomon, was able to comprehend the birds and the like. So we do know that they have some form of communication, but man's ability of speech is very special. So we find from the very beginning of creation that man is being given the ability of speech. Well, then he must have been given the language. It's not just the ability to make sounds that through evolution of sorts became more and more developed. No, from the very beginning he's given the ability of speech, which includes also language. As you remember from last week, perhaps, we spoke about how at the very beginning it was all one language. As the Torah says, in Am Echad v'Safa Echad leKulam, when they were building the Tower of Babel. Hashem therefore says, I'm not going to allow them to complete the building. Hava nerda unvala sham sefatam, asher lo yishmeu ish et sfat reo. I'm going to confuse them. I'm going to mix up their language so they should not comprehend each other. Now, what will happen when I confuse their language? What does that mean, confuse their language? Does it mean that it's going to be a brand new language? Not necessarily a brand new language. It just means that if somebody asks for a brick, he got a hammer instead. He asked for a hammer, he got a brick. In other words, words became changed, letters were dropped perhaps, sounds became a little bit different. And once the sounds become a little bit different, then you don't immediately understand what he's saying. I don't know how many of you have been to England, but there's certain parts of England that if you arrive there for the first time, you're going to have to ask the man to repeat what he said 10 times before you understand. But you speak English. But it's a different accent. And depending what part of England he's from, some accents are difficult for the first time to understand. And there are some words that are different too. I'm not even speaking about the word, just the accent. So what's happening here, and this is an important point to keep in mind, you'll understand why soon. It's important to keep in mind that what's happening is several things. It's not necessarily just words changing, it's sounds changing, letters being dropped, letters being moved around in a different order. The same word, but different order of the same letters. Everything is being transposed, everything is being changed. Because we will see these various changes in the languages that followed. We will actually see this, so it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about change, there's all kinds of changes that occur in a language. על כן קרא שמה בבל, כי שם בלל השם שפת כל הארץ, ומשם מפיצם השם על כל פני הארץ. That's where Hashem mixed up the languages, and from there he scattered them all over the world. Now that's also another additional point. He scattered them. And what happens when he scattered them all over the world? We find in describing the various families during the time of the Mabul, especially after the 3 sons of Noah come out, they are the only survivors, they form new families. It says very clearly that from the children of Noah, from these, the islands of the nations separated in their lands, each one to his language according to their families in their nations. So what we're seeing is, little by little, there is already mention of languages being formed or being developed in various parts of the world because they're all being scattered, each one with his language. And according to tradition, you may have heard the term 70 languages. Well, those 70 languages could have been the original 70 that in the very beginning were somewhat similar. They even sounded alike. Many of the words were the same, the very first languages, like Aramaic, as you will soon see. Aramaic was one of the first languages that evolved from Lashon HaKodesh, so therefore it's more similar. But as they're being scattered and they're going farther and farther and farther from each other, there's going to be greater and greater changes. Why? Why is there going to be greater and greater changes in the future without borrowing from other languages? Without borrowing, there's going to be much more change because geography, distance causes this change. People who live in New York don't speak the same English that you do. We live in the same country. Their accent is different. Some of their terms may be different. Now today, there is more similarities because there's radio and there's TV. There's all this mass communication that allows everybody to hear each other. But people who grew up here, people who grew up there, for the most part, will speak differently. Distance, somehow, and it's not very well understood why, but I personally believe that in the same way that our tradition says that the geography affects the looks and the appearance of people, how you look depending on where you were born, the same thing, somehow the climate, the mountains, the geography, the location of where people are somehow affects their mode of speech. And this was true even with one of the tribes, Ephraim. They had a hard time saying shibolet. They said sibolet. The sh, they couldn't say sh. They said s. And this problem in linguistics still exists today in Japanese, for example, between the L and the R. Now, there are some sounds that some peoples have a harder time pronouncing. I mean, in the English language, you don't have the het. You don't have a het or ein in English, right? So there are certain sounds that are always going to be lost over time, and I'll talk about that next week. What happened to original het and ein? Why the Ashkenazim don't pronounce it that way? But we're seeing that because of the geography, dialects are being formed, and that's what dialects are. Dialects means that you have a language that eventually evolves little by little, becomes a little bit different, but still, you can recognize that who the mother, or what the mother tongue is. Which one is it? We find that the families coming from the children of Noach are the ones that are going to make up the new world. The whole world has been destroyed. So everybody that is alive today comes from either Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Ham, for the most part, is the African continent. Shem are the Semites, which was mostly the Middle East and Asia Minor. And Yafet was Europe. But that was in the very beginning. Remember, people are going all over the place. And remember, we spoke about the continental drift. The continents also drifted and separated. And eventually, you have Inca Indians in South America, Mayas and Aztecs in Central America. Where did they come from? Eventually, the continents drifted, of course. People moved, people traveled, and they got to where they got to. And took with them the language, of course. And at some point, what's happening at some point is that we're losing track of the link of where this language comes from, because you're having certain peoples or certain civilizations destroyed, erased, forgotten. So that link is missing. Why is this important to know? Because today, the majority of the languages today are several generations removed from the very beginning. So if we're going to try to take a language like a new language like Irish, which is not such a new language, and try to figure out, well, let's see if we can find where the similarities are between Irish and Lashon HaKodesh. There have been several languages in between Irish and Lashon HaKodesh. And some of them we know, some of them we don't know. So if we're missing a link, it's going to be harder unless we follow certain rules. If we follow certain rules, we'll be able to figure it out. But even if you follow certain rules, I have some news to tell you. It's important to keep in mind, and that's what the linguists don't completely appreciate. Even though I'm going to prove to you, to some satisfaction, that all the languages come from Lashon HaKodesh, you may ask, well, there's so many words that you can't prove. Well, of course not. Why? Several reasons. First of all, sometimes a particular term may have more than one word, more than one name, more than one way of describing it. Take Japanese and Chinese, for example. A lot of times when they are describing an animal, they're actually not using a name that they took from some other language. They're describing by the 24 strokes of making that picture. 24 strokes sometimes to make a picture. They're describing that this animal eats grass and chews it and does what it. They're putting together all the actions and functions of this animal to describe. Now, they could have borrowed the name from some other language. For some reason, they didn't. Days of the week. Many languages call the days of the week based on astrology. You know what Monday is? What's Monday? Monday is the day of the moon. Lundi, lunedì, lunes, is in the Latin languages, right? These languages chose to use these names of the 7 main planets to describe the days of the week, because each one of those planets rules the first hour of the day of that particular day. And we agree with that in Judaism. We know that too. But we don't use those names. We use Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. Same thing with Arabic, right? Different, and there are some languages that have different ways of calling the names of the days of the week. Portuguese has a whole different way of calling the days of the week. Nothing to do with astrology. It has to do with the markets, with the days of the market. So therefore, you can have a particular word describing something that is not necessarily derived from an old proto-language. And therefore, you won't see the connection to Hebrew from this word. What does Monday have to do with Yom Sheni? Nothing. It's not supposed to have anything because they decided to call Monday something else. Now, hopefully, what we're going to do is we're going to put together a list of the most common words that we know for sure existed then. And I say existed then because the telephone did not exist. So most languages today have no choice but to call it telephone, pronouncing it differently. Take the word banana. If you look up a dictionary of 26 languages or 100, however many languages you want, and you look up banana, guess what you're going to find? Most of the countries in the world, most of the languages will call it banana or something like that. Why? Because they didn't have it. They didn't necessarily. Bananas didn't grow in Sweden. So how are they going to call it? You know? Unless you take somebody who's into languages and wants to make a new word. He's such a patriot of his language, like there have been some in France and in Israel who wanted to make a real Hebrew word for telephone. And you know what they called it? Sachrachok. Sachrachok means conversing from a distance. There's even a word for pajamas. If you use it, they won't understand you in Israel. But there's a word. It's called namnemet, to drowse off. There is a word that entered the Hebrew lexicon today in Israel. And it's the word for check. If you go to a bank and you want to give a check, cash a check, they'll understand what the word check is. Anybody know the real Hebrew, modern Hebrew word for check? Huh? No? Mazit, what? Hamcha. Yofi. So if you want to speak correct Hebrew, modern Hebrew today, you say Hamcha. They'll understand you most, but not Olim Chadashim. Newcomers to Israel won't know that word. Anyway, there are always new words being formed intentionally. Yes. And for whatever reason, a lot of words in various languages were chosen for whatever reason. Not necessarily are they derived from Lashon HaKodesh. So therefore, don't make the mistake of thinking that every single word in every single language, somehow I have to be able to figure out how it's connected. No, not necessarily. Languages have changed in many ways. Yeah.
But like Hashem knew that there was going to be a telephone one day, so
Right.
there should be a Hebrew word for it that's the real Hebrew word for it, right?
Not necessarily. You know how many words are there in the English language today? Over 600,000, they say. There's so much computer terminology, so much stuff in the medicine field. What are you going to call it, So there's always new words. Even 10 years ago, Did you know 10 years ago what a DVD is? Anyway, it's a new term, DVD. Today we take it for granted. Anyway, another thing I want to warn you about, if you're a serious student of etymology, you don't want to be confused by what's called false cognates. What's false cognates? Phonology is the study of sounds. Sounds are important because we're going to be looking at certain similarities in sound. But the problem is that it's not always going to help us because, as I said before, letters are dropped, letters are switched. So the sound is not going to help us too much. But what happens sometimes that you have to be careful with is false cognates. What's false cognates? Words that sound the same in two different languages. Great! They must come from each other. You know what the typical example is? Anybody who speaks Farsi will understand. How do you say bad in Farsi? Bad. You think that word comes from the Farsi word bad or the Farsi from the English? No way. Has nothing to do with each other. It's a coincidence, yes. That's a real coincidence. It's called a false cognate. False. In other words, don't be misled to think that bad in English, which means, which is bad, comes from the word in Farsi, bad, which is the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. But that's not the case with father and mother. There are many words, because what did we say before? Farsi, Persian is an Indo-European languages. There will be words that are similar. There will be things that you will find that are similar between them. Anyway, as we going on and reading the Torah, we find later on with the story of Yaakov an introduction to Aramaic. Vaikralo lavan yegar sahaduta veYaakov karalo gal'ed. So in the Torah itself, you don't have to go to Sefer Daniel, which has a lot of Aramaic, or Ezra. Just go to the Torah itself. You will find here and there words in another language. The Torah is Lashon HaKodesh, but the Torah is already recognizing at this point in the history, close to 2,000 years, about a little over 2,000 years after creation, that Aramaic is in use. In what area of the world? In Syria, in Iraq, in certain parts of Iraq. Lavan calls this pillar of stones Yegar Sahaduta, which is an Aramaic term. Yaakov calls it Gal Ed, a pillar that is testimonial of their covenant, of their agreement. So here in one pasuk you have a translation into another language, a close relative of Hebrew. Gal Ed and Yegar Sahaduta. Okay. I was going to put you a list of all the languages in the world, and I decided that we don't have the time to go through them because there are over 5,000. If you want to know how many languages there are in the world today that are spoken by some people, even by a few people, there's, I think, actually a little over 6,000, 6,700, 6,800. I don't remember the last count. I'll tell you why it's not so important. Because many of them are dialects, different forms of the same language, so they're not really true languages. Some of them are not spoken by too many people. So we still have many, many languages. What I did over here is just put together a few slides of which languages were being spoken early on, and the more or less the timing in history based on when they were discovered, tablets of things that were written in those languages. You have in the very beginning, you have the Sumerian languages, you have the Egyptian, you have the Akkadian, of course, you have the Hittites, the Canaanites, Ugaritic, Old Chinese. Yes, Old Chinese. It's one of the early languages, but not in the very, very beginning, but it's already appearing about 1,000 to 1,400 BC. It was before the Common Era. Then you have Phoenician, Aramaic, even though I don't agree with this chart. I think Aramaic was much earlier, and so was Hebrew. But remember, this is not being put together by a Jew, this table. Aramaic and Hebrew were much before the rest of them. But that's when they're seeing information being written in those languages. Phrygian, Moabite, Ammonite, Etruscan was a language that was spoken in Italy before Italian came to be, before Latin even. Then you have Thracian, Old Persian, later on which became Avestan, the Avestan language. You have the Gez language that's spoken in Ethiopia, which is also an old language. Iberian, they claim, is a language that was spoken in the Iberian Peninsula, where you have today Spain and Portugal. Before Spanish and Portuguese, or Catalan, became the spoken language in that area. So there was some language being spoken, and they call it Iberian. All of this is before the Second Temple, or during that time approximately. Then you have the various Indian languages, the Mayan language. Tamil is one of the South Indian languages. Korean, it's a little much more of a newer language. Okay, everybody can recognize that? That's a donkey, right? Okay, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you an example, and then we're going to go to the actual breakdown of the rules. So I just want to give you one example, just to make it a little bit fun, of how we know a particular word comes from Lashon HaKodesh. And then we're going to go to the rules. Does donkey come from Lashon HaKodesh? The answer is no. Does anybody know what's another name for a donkey? Just spell it out. You don't have to say it. ASS, right. Everybody understand what I said? Yeah. Okay. People know it more by donkey. Mule is something completely different. But donkey and ASS are the same thing. Why is it called a donkey? Donkey slang. For the most part, I did a little bit of research. It's not a real word. It is not really derived. I think there's one language that has it too. Something similar to that. But the word donkey really is a slang that came to be not too long ago to describe this animal. For some reason. Let's not talk about the reason. There could be all sorts of reasons. The real word for this is therefore ASS. So therefore, if you're going to start looking for the origin of the word donkey, you're going to be lost. You won't find it. You won't find it in any even European language. So you have to be smart and say, wait a minute, maybe this animal is known as something else. And it happens to be yes. Okay, let's take a look a little bit at the languages that we're more familiar with. What is that ASS animal called in other languages? Asino in Italian. Asno o burro in Spanish. Âne in French. Esel in German. Asiol in Russian. Hmar in Arabic. Can anybody read the Chinese? No? In Chinese, it's liu. All right? In Basque, it's asto. In Portuguese, it could be the jumento or asno. In Czech, it's ozel. Do you start seeing anything over here? What are you seeing so far? You're seeing that a lot of these are somewhat similar to ASS, right? So ASS comes from these. Or these are all coming from some language that has those letters in it. Anybody know in Farsi how you say a donkey? Oh, because you saw it. Huh? How do you say Farsi, in Farsi, donkey? There's no other word for it? Aton. Aton. You didn't hear that one, no? Okay. There are various words in Farsi for, but this one is the more common one, that's why I put it in. Okay. In Swedish, it's osna. Okay. And in Hebrew, of course, hamor. And in Finnish, asi. Now, what are we seeing? Hungarian also, samar. And there's more languages, but this is enough for now. Actually, Kyrgyz, Mongolian, and Turkish, which they have a similar way, they call it eshek. Okay, fine. The question right now is, can we see from this any connection to Lashon HaKodesh? If you don't know the rules, you can't easily see. But if you know Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh very well, you say, well, wait a minute. I just thought of something. There's another word for hamor in Lashon HaKodesh. A female hamor. Anybody know? Aton. Aleph, Taf, Vav, Nun. So therefore, who's to say that you're going to find a derivative of hamor, which is difficult to pronounce for those that don't have a het? Maybe they will call it the female donkey, Aton. And guess what? All these languages who have ASAL or ASN is Aton. You're going to see the rules that make it so. But can you already see what I'm talking about? Could you already see what I'm talking about? That all those that have Azel, or Asi, or Asal, or Asna, right? They're all from Aton. It's the same root. Aleph, Taf, Nun, ASN. Because that's the root. So forget about the last vowel, the first vowel. Look at the root. And the root is going to be 3 letters. Okay. Arabic and Hebrew, of course, they like the word hamor. They like calling people hamor too. So they use hamor, hamar. What about Hungarian? Maybe Hungarians too. They have a little bit of the hamor in there. They have the last 3 letters of their word, mar. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not saying for sure. Keep in mind, as I show you examples, that not all of this is guaranteed. Some of it is very, very evident, but not all of it is guaranteed. But it's interesting. But what about the Kyrgyz language and the Mongolian language, Elshig? And we'll get to Farsi in a minute. Eshek, if you see Kyrgyz, everybody can see Kyrgyz? It's written in the Cyrillic script, the Russian script. It says there Eshek. And so does in Mongolian, using the Russian Cyrillic script here. It says Elshig. What does that have to do with hamor or asno? Nothing. It's a completely different word. This word, eshek, if you speak Farsi well, should remind you of another word. Anybody who really is good in Farsi, think of a word that's close to the root eshek, but pronounce the first vowel a little bit different. No, come on. Where are all the Persian people here? Ishq. Do you know what ishq is? You don't know what ishq is? You've been away a long time. Okay, you should know what ishq is. Ishq. Transliterated ISHQ. How do you say passion? Oh, you pronounce it ishq? You pronounce it eshk? Okay, some pronounce it ishq. I guess depends which part, ishq or eshk. But you still should have figured it out because it's eshek. Not enough time. Okay, so what's eshk? Passion. It's a deeper love, not just love. When you want a deep passion, you use the word eshk, right? You know where the word eshk comes from? No. From Lashon HaKodesh, there's the word tshuka. Cheshek. It's all part of the same thing. Cheshek, tshuka is a passion. It's all the same thing. That's for sure the same root. It could be, this is my idea, the reason why these languages are using eshek or elzhig, it could be that they are trying to describe this animal that has a big appetite. The hamor has a big appetite for certain things, more than anything else. The hamor, yes, the burro, the donkey. And it could be that they are describing using another word, not necessarily original word that they had to borrow or receive by inheritance from someone. They're using their way of describing this animal. After all, in Spanish too, they like to use the word burro. Where did that come from? It's not, even though asno is also a Spanish word from Latin, but where did burro come to be? Burro has to do with describing the coloration of this animal. It's an old word that comes from old Latin or Greek. I don't recall right now accurately, that it describes 2 things. It describes a small little horse, which is this, and it describes the color of it like a dark brownish red. That's where so that word somehow was used somewhere to describe the same animal that is called asno or donkey. So you're seeing additional words that are not necessarily derived from Lashon HaKodesh, not necessarily to describe this animal. So it could be the same is true with these other languages. Okay, here's some of my some examples that I've discovered on my own. This one is not such a big deal, except that you'll still have to think a little bit to know what the origin of it is from Hebrew. What we do see in this chart are similarities to each other because they're all Indo-European languages, whether it's Sanskrit, English, Persian, Ancient Greek, Latin, Pashto, Romanian, Serbian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Irish, and Armenian. What do we see over here? We see the word new, whether it's nava, whether it's no, neos in Greek, novus, on nawai in Pashto, no, nov. Then we have two words in Latvian and Lithuanian that appear to be very different. Can anybody see why those two are not different? Even though it says J-A-U-N-S or N-A-U-J-A-S, can anybody see why those two words are exactly from the same source? The letters are switched around. Could you see it? Look at the Latvian one. Look where the N is. Right? You have the A, you have the U, you have the N, but just switch the order of the letters and you have the same word more or less. Same thing with the Lithuanian word. Nuwa, and then in Armenian, I have the Armenian script plus the word nor, which is the same. Yeah. However, we don't see here, even though they are similar, how do we know this comes from Lashon HaKodesh? It may be difficult to tell, but it's possible that the word that this is derived from is the word in Hebrew, nava, not hadash. Hadash has nothing to do with this, no matter which rules you follow. What's the word nava mean? Anybody know Hebrew? Nava. Beautiful, something nice is nava. People could have used this word to describe something new. Then nava. Na'e, nava. Yes. Words, remember, were being interchanged. Words were modified. There were synonyms that more or less meant similar things. So somehow they borrowed that word instead of the word hadash. It doesn't have to be the hadash had to be changed into becoming. It could be in some other language, yes. But in these, somehow they all decided over time to stick to that term, and that term stuck. Another example is the number 3. Okay, somebody's going to ask me about the Farsi word, se. What does se have to do with 3? Well, you have, I didn't say does. 3, the first one in Sanskrit, that's easy, 3. Tres, trei, tri, tris, three, yerek. So far, they all seem to be similar to the word 3, right? But here I'm a little bit confused about the Persian one. Right? Se. Okay, how do we say 3 in Hebrew? Shalosh. Could you see how 3 comes from shalosh? Not really if you don't know the rules, but if you pay close attention to what we said before, L and R are one of those letters that are interchangeable. Shalosh. S and T can easily be interchangeable. So S and T, S becomes T, L becomes R. So what do you have already? You have the TR. You drop the last shin and you have 3. This is not a trick. This is not a game. This is real rules in phonology, in how certain sounds are changed in different languages, but it's pretty much the same. So se is easier to understand because se still has the shin being converted to an S, just without the lamed. And the word shesh, of course, in Farsi is exactly the same as in Hebrew. But what about the word for 1 in Farsi? Can anybody guess? That's so easy. Yeah, how? drop the D, and the ya becomes a. The second letter, instead of ka, is cha. So what do you have? Ach, echad. It's the same thing, but you don't think about it when you first see it. Okay? You don't think about it, but it's the exact same thing. I guarantee it. Okay, another example. Mother and father. You know what some people want to say? Those who don't believe in this? That the reason why all the babies in the world start saying mama, mama, mama is because that's the easiest sound for them to call their mother. But it's not true. A lot of languages in the world have something in common in describing the mother. The letter M-A for some reason. Well, now we know why. Because it's ima. Nothing to do with being an easy sound to make. A lot of languages, I just put a few. Look what's happening in the Indo-European languages, which are very close relatives. You have either mater or mother or madar, mater, mama, maika, mate, motina. There's many, many more, but they're all related. What do they have in common? The MA, all from ima. Okay, before we go to the last screen over here, I just want to share with you the work of an individual who describes a little bit more the rules so you can understand briefly how this works. His name is Isaac Mosesen. Did a nice job in putting together. He has a book called The Word. And even though I don't necessarily agree with everything that he says, but it's interesting how he points out the Edenics, as he calls it. What's Edenics? How everything comes from Eden. Everything comes from the original language that he likes to call Eden. The Eden language, the Hebrew language. Hebrew, the mother of tongues. You will find all kinds of words that may or may not have similarities because they either sound the same or because the root is found in these languages. Look at the word regular in English. Regular, ragil. To be regular, to be ragil. It's exact same root. Regularity. But it gets more interesting and more confusing when you see the following. There are, as I said before, certain roots that if you know which letters to drop and you keep to the root itself will not only be found in other languages, but that root, as we will see next week, is actually found in many similar words. For example, what does apricot, look at the English over there, what does apricot, pear, prune, plum, and apple have in common? They're all fruits, right? What letters do they have in common? The P and the R. The P and the R appear in the Hebrew word pri, fruit. In the word perach also, flower. In the word fertile, even though it's F and R, but F is interchangeable with P, as we will soon see, F and P. You're getting already the idea of what's happening over here? So you look at the word perach and you don't understand what's going on, but here you see that there can be a lot of words. I'm not guaranteeing that every single one of these words comes from pri or perach, but it could be that some do because of this rule of roots. Kelev. Rabbis tell us why is he called Kelev? Ki kulo lev. He's all one piece of heart. He's the best pet. He's very devoted. He's all heart. Lev. Kulo lev. So the word kol, all, whole, can be seen in the word kol. Lev, love. Not necessarily, but it's interesting. You have another example of two letters in Hebrew of min. Look how they appear in English. The minish, mini, number, right? A lot of these words have the same root and somehow similar meanings. Shafel, which means to be low. You will find some of the letters in this root in the words spill, slip, slump, slumber, sleep. So even though they're not directly derived from shafel, but the roots are. The roots are being changed into pronouncing it differently and creating a new word that is similar in its action that is being performed. Very briefly, I don't want to tire you with all the rules, but Mr. Grimm was an individual who put together some basic rules that help us understand actually how this works. And it's called Grimm's Law of Letter Changes. In the Dikduk of Lashon HaKodesh, it's understood too. As the Zohar says, the various sounds that we make come from different parts of the mouth. For example, the letters datlenet, da, ta, la, na, ta, they come from the tongue. Right? Bumaf, bet, vav, mem, pei come from the mouth. Then you have aleph, het, ain, that comes from the throat, otiot groniot. Zas tzarash, zayin, sadik, samach, resh, shin, fricative, as they're called in English, fricative, from the teeth. So these letters, if you keep track of all these sounds, you will know that within its own group, these sounds sometimes change. So for example, in Grimm's law of letter changes, you will have three kinds of major changes. Added letters, usually the nasal ones, M and N. Some languages are nasal, and they add, as we will soon see. Metathesis is the switching the position of root letters, which we saw some example, and inversions. Also, that are completely switched around. Let's see examples of each one of these real quickly. Added letters, as I said before, is N and M's are usually tend to be or other nasal letters that are added in the various Latin languages. He has an example of the word arrange, which comes from orech, which means to order or organize. Similar roots, but there's an extra N there. So if you drop that extra N, you are able to see a little bit better the root of orech. Possibly. The CH, remember, is a difficult sound to make in English, so it's being dropped. Could be, possibly. Let's go to another example. The switching of the letters. Even in the Torah, you will find keves and kesev, the same word for sheep, but sometimes written keves and sometimes kesev. So that also happens in other languages too, where there's a switch in the order of the letters sometimes. Inversions. As he points out over here, the combination of two Adenic letters creates sound and sense in all human words, but not the conventional order in which they are spelled. So you may have things that are completely switched around than they first appear in the original language. Here are the ones that I spoke about, some examples of the letters in the groups, as they call them, the bilabials, the gutturals, the dentals, the liquids, the nasals, the fricatives. These letters tend to switch off depending on the language. And if you are aware of them, it will be easier to decipher the root of the word in case the root is Lashon HaKodesh. Anybody who knows Yiddish, for example, will know that in Yiddish, to the name Yaakov, they call Yankel, which is another example of a nasal sound that is added. The N is added to the root, Aleph Kuf Beit, Yankel. Instead of Bet, it's made into Lamed. Look at the word, look at the root Ain Kuf Lamed, Akol, Akal, to bend or to curve. What about the word angle? Angle in English. Look at the root. Drop the N, and you will see the same root and a similar idea. It doesn't have to be the exact same idea, but similar idea. Angle, ankle. Here's some quick examples of words that have roots, but with nasalization. Antique is exactly like atik, old. Just drop the N. And if you can see the rest of them, many of them have the roots or part of the roots of the Lashon HaKodesh word for the same exact word. Here's an example of metathesis, the switching of the letters. Let's take an example. I like the word degree. Everybody can see the word degree? Degree, the third word in English. Darga in Hebrew. It's easy to see it. Just two letters are switched there. Degree, darga. Grid, geder. You have even dark and kedar or koder. Maybe yes, maybe not. Not necessarily is he right, but he's giving here some examples that he's found based on these rules that may originate from Lashon HaKodesh. Here are inversions. Look at how everything changes the order. Reversed roots, alto and tall. And this one, of course, is something that he decided to add, that in the English language, the English dictionary, they don't want to admit that the word to babble comes from Babel. But apparently it does, or could be. They don't know what the origin of this language is, of that particular word is. Goliath. Look at the word Goliath. There is a word colossus that possibly takes from this word, Goliath, meaning a giant, a tall person. Same thing with Og. Og appearing in the words huge, ogre. And a few birds. Adam HaRishon called the birds, the animals, a name based on what it did, how it behaved. Buzzard, everybody know what a buzzard is? It's a type of vulture. Maybe part of that word comes from the Hebrew root buzz, which is to waste, to loot. What does that have to do with a buzzard? Because a buzzard eats all the carrion, the dead animals. It cleans up, it takes the waste, whatever is left over. Possibly, maybe. It's a kind of vulture, yeah, buzzard, yeah. Giraffe. Now, what does giraffe have to do with oref? Well, giraffe has a big back. Big neck, that's oref. And if you switch the letters around a little bit, you will find that the G, R, and the F appear in the Ayin, Resh, and Pei. In other words, similar root, similar letters. Same thing with Garon, necks, long necks. You have the heron, H-R-N. Look at the root of the word. Drop the vowels. The heron, the egret, the crane, they all have long necks. The orev, the raven, also basic letters are there. And one more, the chofer, the digger. A real quick example of how you can have many languages that for some reason chose to use the same or similar description for a flea. And a flea we know existed back then. It's not like a telephone, right? There were always fleas. So the word in Hebrew for flea is parosh. Okay, so what's going to be, now that you know a little bit about linguistics, what's going to be the root over here? What are we going to look for? We're going to look for the pei, we're going to look for a reish, and we're going to look for a shin. Because an ayin doesn't really exist in all the languages, right? So we're going to look for the main letters, the pei, the reish, and the shin. And what did we see before? A pei is interchangeable with an F. A reish is interchangeable with a lamed. And a shin with an S. Oh, good, easy. Parosh, pei, reish, ayin, flee. Fly, flee. Pei becomes an F, R becomes an L, right? And in this case, in the word flee, the shin is dropped. But if you look at all the languages, whether it's Spanish, pulga, it has the pei and the lamed, P-L, P-R. You look at Turkish, pire, flow in German, and even in Swahili, kiroboto. Yeah, did you ever hear of Swahili? It's an important language, spoken in East Africa. Kiroboto, you have the K, the R, the B, and the T. You have a little bit of that same root somehow, modified somewhat, but it's still part of the same root. Look at the Russian, the Slavic languages, calling it blocha. You have, instead of a P, you have a B, because P and B are interchangeable just like P and F. But they are using a guttural. They're using the ch sound because they have a ch sound. Instead of the ayin, they're using a ch. Now, there were languages before these that perhaps called it something a little bit different, but here apparently we still have some connection to Lashon HaKodesh. Look at the word emet. From the Greeks, in the Greek you have etmos, coming from the word emet. And of course, in the end of days, we have, of course, the famous prophecy, in the end, it will always come back to one language when Mashiach comes. What I want to do right now is just cover one more point that is cute and interesting to note, that doesn't really have anything to do with Lashon HaKodesh, but it has to do a little bit with languages. For those of you who are interested in languages. This is one of my favorite. Can everybody read it? Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. 1 second. Oops. Okay. Mumagamaga. Can everybody read the word? Mumagama gama. Mumagama gama. What? Yeah? That's a real word in Swahili. Remember Swahili? And what does it mean? It means someone who habitually loses things. You know people like that? Mumagama gama. Mumagama gama. Anyway, why did I include this? Languages, as much as they may be derived from other languages, as much as they may sound alike, they're unique. You cannot always translate from one language to another, even if you know both languages well and you know the context. You have to know the context and you have to know both languages well in order to be able to translate. Because what's happening? In conveying ideas, language is not only about communication, it's about conveying ideas. Some languages have certain ideas that are difficult to convey in another language. It doesn't exist. And a good example that Zalman you'll recognize is Yiddish, shlumil and shlumazel. Do you know what a shlumil and a shlumazel is? Okay. There are two guys going down the hall. The shlumil carries a cup of tea in his hand and he spills it on the shlumazel. So the shlumil is the one that fell, that wasn't careful, and the shlumazel is the one that had the bad luck of having it fall on his pants. And you say to his, and if you ask somebody that knows Yiddish well, ask him, where does shlumazel come from? He says, I don't. It comes from mazel, shlum mazel. It comes from having a bad mazel. Yeah. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You got the cup of tea on you. Anyway, Yiddish is an incredible language. It's a Jewish language that, even though comes from German, real Yiddish, pure Yiddish, that was evolved about 1,000 years ago, and it contains about 90% of Old German, 6% Hebrew, and 4% Slavic words. Depending on which country in Eastern Europe you came from, whether it was from Poland, Russia, Hungary, Romania, or Czechoslovakia, they had different words for different things, but most of it was based on the older German. It became a Jewish language because the Am Yisrael, even though they were dispersed in the Galut, and they did not really use Lashon HaKodesh, and many of them have forgotten Lashon HaKodesh, they still wanted to speak their own language. Unfortunately, the United States of America is one of the only countries in the world that the Jew does not know to speak a Jewish language. He speaks English. And Iran too. Not everybody spoke a Jewish language. there was what they call a Jewish Persian, but not everybody spoke it. Just like there was a Jewish Spanish, Ladino. There were Jewish forms of the language in the country. That's what Yiddish is, right? It's important for the Jews to have their language, their words, their way of expressing themselves. And that is one of the ways of preserving their identity. Language was always important. One of the ways that unfortunately people begin to assimilate to the ways of the Goyim is by beginning to speak their language, by beginning to dress like the Goyim, by beginning to adapt their customs. So what I try to do over here, of course, is not only to show you how everything comes from Lashon HaKodesh, grammatically, lexically, linguistically, but ultimately, Lashon HaKodesh is the first and most important language of all. That's the language that we should learn, that we should know well. It's the language that the Malachim understand. One who prays in Lashon HaKodesh, his prayers are more effective. They're heard, even if he doesn't understand what he's saying. He therefore pays to learn Lashon HaKodesh because Bezrat Hashem very soon, that will be the universal language. No more French, no more Latin, no more Anglo-Saxon. It will be Bezrat Hashem, Lashon HaKodesh. Amen.